In the heart of the English countryside, cloaked by ancient oaks and the whispers of a forgotten time, stood Blackwood Manor. Built 1,000 years ago, the house was a decaying testament to Gothic grandeur. Its once majestic spires now sagged with age, and ivy clawed at the weathered stone walls like desperate fingers. Few dared to approach it. Fewer still spoke of its dark reputation. Yet, for 17-year-old Lila Gray, Blackwood Manor was home. A life in shadows. Lila had lived in the manor her entire life. Left an orphan after her parents' mysterious deaths, she was raised by her reclusive grandmother, Agnes. Agnes, a frail woman with cataract-clouded eyes, spoke in riddles about the house's past. She often warned Lila, "Never go below the basement, child. Not all secrets are meant to be uncovered." The manor's eerie atmosphere became Lila's normal. The echo of footsteps in empty halls, doors creaking open of their own accord, and whispers that came from nowhere no longer startled her. She had learned to coexist with the house's oddities, believing them to be harmless, until her grandmother died. Agnes' death left Lila alone in the cavernous manor. With her passing, the house seemed to awaken. The shadows grew darker, the whispers louder, and the once familiar creaks turned into menacing groans. It was as though the manor mourned Agnes or celebrated her departure. One stormy evening, as lightning illuminated the ancient halls, Lila stumbled upon a door she had never noticed before. It was in the basement, hidden behind a tattered tapestry. The door was wrought iron, its surface etched with strange runes that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. A key hung from a chain around her neck, a keepsake from Agnes. To her shock, it fit perfectly. As the lock clicked open, a chilling gust of air escaped, carrying with it a low, guttural moan. Beyond the door was a spiral staircase descending into darkness. Against her better judgment, Lila ventured down. The stairs led to a vast underground network of catacombs. The walls were lined with skulls, their hollow eyes watching her every move. In the center of the main chamber stood an ancient altar, stained with something dark and dried. Surrounding it were inscriptions written in a language Lila couldn't comprehend. As she approached the altar, a sudden rush of cold air extinguished her candle. Panic set in as the darkness enveloped her. She fumbled for her lighter, but before she could ignite it, the whispers returned. Louder, closer, more insistent. They spoke her name, each syllable dripping with malice. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, skeletal, and draped in tattered robes. Its face was a grotesque mask of decayed flesh and empty eye sockets that burned with an unnatural red light. It raised a bony hand, and the whispers turned into an ear-splitting scream. As Lila tried to retreat, the walls of the catacombs pulsated like a living creature, bleeding dark ichor that smelled of decay. She stumbled into a smaller chamber where shadowy figures replayed scenes of torment, their cries echoing in her ears. The walls seemed alive, and hands reached out from their surfaces, their skeletal fingers scraping at her skin and leaving bloody trails. The floor beneath her feet turned to brittle bone that cracked and collapsed, revealing a bottomless abyss below. A mirror materialized out of the dark, showing her reflection. But it wasn't her. It was a monstrous, decayed version of herself. As she ran from the sight, she passed a well that emanated an unbearable sound, a symphony of screams and sobs that pierced her mind. From the altar she had passed earlier, a swarm of black insects erupted, crawling up her legs and whispering cryptic words in an unearthly language. The inscriptions on the walls began to glow, revealing themselves as the names of past victims who had succumbed to the house's curse. Nearby, she encountered a child's toy, a cracked porcelain doll, which suddenly turned its head and laughed with a hollow, echoing sound. In another moment of horror, a figure resembling her grandmother appeared, but her eyes were empty sockets, and her voice was a twisted mockery of Agnes's loving tone. Lila felt phantom hands around her throat, choking her, though nothing visible was there when she turned. A door slammed shut behind her, locking her in a chamber that filled with a rising tide of black liquid, defying all natural laws. She heard footsteps following her, but every time she turned to look, no one was there. Only her shadow, unnaturally long and flickering like a flame. The skeletal figure reappeared, dragging heavy chains that clinked and rattled as it approached her. Finally, she discovered an ancient journal left by someone who had lived in the manor long ago. The journal's pages were filled with desperate scribbles, warnings from past inhabitants who had all succumbed to the manor's power. Each entry spoke of terror, madness, and ultimately death. As the catacombs twisted and stretched beyond comprehension, Lila encountered rooms that defied logic. One chamber was filled with clocks of all shapes and sizes, each ticking at,
as if mocking the passage of time. Another room contained lifelike statues that seemed to breathe, their eyes following her every movement. A gallery of grotesque paintings adorned another hall, each depicting scenes of her life, but distorted and ending in violent, horrifying deaths. In one particularly haunting chamber, she found a banquet table laden with rotting food. As she approached, the chairs around the table creaked and shifted. Spectral figures appeared, seated and laughing in grotesque silence. Their hollow laughter grew louder, filling her ears until she screamed. Her path eventually led her to a cavernous room where the ceiling seemed to stretch infinitely. Suspended above her were cages, each containing a shadowy, writhing figure. Their screams echoed through the room, blending into a cacophony of despair. One of the cages lowered itself slowly, revealing a figure that resembled her father. But when she called out, it turned its face to her, a featureless void that opened into a dark, yawning mouth. In another hallway, she discovered a room filled with music.
boxes, each playing hauntingly discordant tunes. When she wound one, a ghostly figure of a young girl appeared, mouthing words Leela could not hear, but whose presence filled her with dread. Another room held a decrepit rocking chair, rocking furiously on its own. As she approached, a spectral figure of a woman suddenly appeared, shrieking and lunging toward her before vanishing into the shadows. In a separate chamber, grotesque marionettes danced without strings, their hollow eyes leaking black tears as they performed a macabre puppet show reenacting her darkest memories. A massive, cracked mirror revealed not just her reflection, but an entire shadowy audience watching her from the other side. Their glowing eyes seemed to pierce through her soul, and when she looked away, she felt their hands grasping at her shoulders. Lila entered another chamber, where an endless spiral of staircases twisted in impossible directions. Each step she climbed led her no closer to escape, and every doorway she passed opened to reveal scenes of her own death, excruciating. In one room, a fireplace roared to life, and from its flames emerged screaming faces, their mouths open wide in eternal torment. The heat seared her skin as she fled. Down another corridor, she found a pool of blood stretching unnaturally across the floor. From its depths, pale, clawed hands reached out, trying to drag her into its crimson void. The entity, which Lila instinctively knew was the source of the manor's curse, spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the very walls. "You are the last of the bloodline. The covenant must be fulfilled." Fragments of Agnes' cryptic warnings flooded Lila's mind. She realized that her family had been caretakers of this dark power for generations, binding it to the house through sacrificial rituals. With Agnes gone, the responsibility now fell to her. Lila tried to run, but the catacombs shifted around her, the walls closing in to force her back toward the altar. The skeletal figure extended a clawed hand, and an unbearable pain ripped through her chest. She looked down to see blood pooling at her feet, yet no wound was visible. The entity was drawing her life force, binding her to the house as its new keeper. The most tragic ending. When Lila awoke, she was back in her room. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, and the room seemed darker than ever. She tried to speak, but found her voice echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the manor. She rushed to the mirror and screamed. Her reflection was no longer hers. The face staring back was hollow, skeletal, and burning with the same red light as the figure she had encountered in the catacombs.